Perhaps one of the most well-known theories or frameworks used to justify actions as ethical is that of utilitarianism. So the basic idea behind utilitarianism is ethics depends upon the outcome for all those involved. So you determine whether something's ethical or not based upon the overall good that's generated, or the least harm if it's a harmful act that occurs for everyone involved. So what we're doing here is broadening the focus from the individual, which is ethical egoism, into society as a whole. So let's get into this with a little bit more detail. So the essence of this approach requires the prediction and analysis of the consequences of all the possible actions for everybody affected by it. Then we make the decision based upon the kind of more positive consequences of the option. So you want to get the option, the alternative that maximizes utility. So for those who haven't done economics yet, utility is kind of the economics words for good or happiness. So we'll run across these terms used interchangeably by the authors, and that's where the whole name of utilitarianism comes from. As with ethical egoism, you're then morally obliged to take this action. Okay, it's morally wrong not to take the action. So we keep coming back to this because it's an important concept. So in this approach, we only look at the consequences, but we broaden it out to look at the good of everyone involved. Now, how do you determine what good is? There's different approaches that have been taken. We're going to look at the classical utilitarianism approach, which says that we should maximize overall happiness, where that's interpreted as more pleasure, less pain. Okay, so I'm going to increase pleasure, decrease pain. There are other contemporary alternatives for that, but this is the one we're going to focus on. Now, one of the real challenges with utilitarianism is that it requires this measurement of happiness. We got two of the key people involved in its development, Bentham and Mill, who lived in the 1800s, and that's when economics is really taking off. The Enlightenment economics, etc. Quantification, right, is what is a key idea starting to permeate all thinking. And so they take this to the kind of nth degree, particularly Bentham, who says, how do you measure net happiness? And he comes up with a key set of dimensions to happiness that we need to look at. The first one, obviously, is the intensity, right? So how intense is that happiness? Some experiences are intensely happy, some are moderately happy, okay? So that's one dimension. A second one is duration. You know, how long does the happiness last? Certainty involves the idea of the probability that this happiness will happen, because there's always some uncertainty around an event. Remoteness. So remoteness is really about how far off is the pleasure, or how near is the pleasure, okay? Because the more remote it is, probably the less it's likely to affect us directly. And he actually called this propinquity, if you ever run across that word, but we'll use the word remoteness. Now, fecundity, okay, what fecundity means, will the pleasure lead to other pleasures? You know, I don't know, so maybe if you go have a few drinks at a bar, you might meet someone nice, right? So one pleasure, going out for a drink with your friends, might lead to other untold pleasures. That's the idea of fecundity that we have here, the knock-on effect. Purity is actually more about a pain, and that's the opposite of fecundity. What's the idea that any pain will lead to further pain? So if you're in an accident, you might have a pain that might then lead to needing an operation, which requires more pain. And extent is the number of people affected. The summary here is that there's a lot of dimensions that we need if we're going to calculate overall happiness. And in fact, he called this the hedonistic calculus, was the technical name that he gave for it. But we have these dimensions when we're measuring utility or happiness. So Bentham's arguing that what we need to do is we need to look at everyone who's affected by our decision or action, and then we estimate their increase or decrease in pain. Then we add, so total, so we add that up for all of the people. And we do that for all the alternatives so that we can compare behaviour A with behaviour B, or decision A with decision B. And we sum that all up to work out the greatest overall happiness. Then that's the proposed action that we're obliged to do. An important point to note here is it is not the number of people. It's the total utility or happiness. Okay, so that's a really important distinction that often students get wrong in this particular area. So what does this require? If you're going to apply it in something like a business setting, in any setting, but particularly in a business setting, identify the stakeholders, the people are affected. Develop a list of consequences for the stakeholders, action, inaction, harm, benefit. Measure the pleasure or pain of each. Calculate the overall. Choose the one that leads to the greatest aggregate pain or pleasure. Here we have a simplified example. We have 5 people being affected, and we have 3 options, whatever they might be. Now what you can see is we've identified the stakeholder, the 5 people affected by this act or omission. Then what we have is the utility generated, the happiness generated for each of the people under each of the options. So under option 1, Anne has 2 units of benefit, Ben has 2 units of benefit, and so on. Under option 2, Anne gets 9 benefit and Ben gets 1, etc. So we can see that the options develop different amounts of pleasure or pain for people. In fact, here we have 2 units of pain for Dan and Ellie in terms of option 3. They're going to lose out of this option. Now notice, our decision, what is the right thing to do, would be determined by the total utility generated. And the highest total utility is under option 3. 12 units of utility, right? So again, it's not about the number of people, right? Option 1 is the option where most people benefit, but that only generates 10 units of utility. This one, even though 2 people are negatively affected, generates more total utility. So this is the moral or ethical action to take. And that's what this slide is really going in a formal sense. Also note that from our earlier slide, it means option 1 or 2 are unethical under this framework. If you adopt this framework in your decision making, you're actually saying options 1 and 2 are unethical. Okay. So again, just to go over a couple of the points, it's net happiness, so we include both pleasure and pain. That's why we had negative numbers in our calculation. It's overall net happiness, not the number of people. You treat everyone's increase or decrease equally. Right? This is a really important point, that no one has priority, unlike ethical egoism. And the calculation considers happiness over both the short and long term. It's meant to be a total score. Okay, meant to be a total score, both long and short term. Now, if you think about this for a couple of seconds, you start to see a lot of the problems practically with this approach. There are some other ethical concerns that we have with the approach, but one of the real practical problems is, how do you actually measure this happiness with the uncertainty of life, with the number of stakeholders, etc., becomes very problematic very quickly. And so you've got to ask yourself, really, how practical is this genuinely to do it the way that it's been envisaged? Okay, so we often then use shortcuts and say, well, the average person and how many average people are there. That kind of approach really underlies, this logic, even if it's not exact, really underlies a kind of business case scenario that we see in business, right? They're calculating the total utility, they're substituting money for utility, looking at the stakeholders. Governments often do this, but even businesses when they're working out what to do. So the key problems are, it's really hard to actually predict the consequences in the real world, and it becomes impractical. There's no agreement on what good should be maximised or how to measure that good. This becomes one of the key challenges for you when you start to, if you use this theory in your assignment, how are you going to measure it? How do you differentiate types of good? Is one type of good, such as the quality of wine, better than other kind of goods, even though both will, give you a bit of a buzz? A really important thing to consider is what happens when we actually apply this theory all the time. What you end up with is some really kind of challenging, if not problematic, outcomes. So, for instance, you should never go on a holiday, right? Why? Because, okay, that generates happiness for you and maybe some people who you're holidaying with. But imagine if you gave that money to the needy. The utility for them would be much greater. So it would suggest lots of kind of wealth transfers, if you think about it. And it would put a limit on the kinds of things that we might want to do or be able to do if we start applying this all the time in every situation. Another key concern that's been raised from an ethics perspective here is it might actually create situations where we get unethical, what we consider to be unethical acts based upon the idea of overall net happiness. So here's a simple example of where torturing someone might actually lead to an overall net pleasure, but a lot of us might think that torture is an unethical thing to engage in. Slavery, things like that, could be justified if the utility units came out the right way. So it can lead to these kind of consequences, which this theory kind of shares with ethical egoism, because they both only care about the consequence, not how you get there. And sometimes we start to worry ethically about how we get to that particular consequence. Finally, we see that a key challenge around the theory is that it doesn't look at how that happiness is distributed. It doesn't look at the volume of people who are affected. And again, you can get those unfair outcomes, what we might think of as unfair outcomes if we have a system where if one or a small cohort gains a lot and a big cohort loses just a little bit. If there's enough gain to offset that negative, utilitarianism says it's the ethical thing to do. So as I was saying before, in terms of business cases, this is a theory that's often used in business, and there's several reasons why it is. Let's have a look at them. So the first one is it's simple to understand. Like, it's pretty easy to understand what's going on here and justify a decision, particularly if we start trading happiness for dollars and we start making dollar calculations around the impact of actions. It looks objective and unbiased. Right? It looks like, yep, we've got a very clear decision set and we follow that decision set. And it's particularly used when people are trading off preferences. When people have different ideas about what's important, this often gets used as a way to try and reconcile some differences. So this overcomes many of the problems that you might have in government, right, around council regulations and government regulation. And really, at its heart, the idea of pursuing profit, which is at the core of business, is based upon the idea that that profit is in some way a measure of happiness, right? That money stores happiness. We can buy things with it. We can do things with it that make us happy or that alleviate pain. And so pursuing profit is a good thing, because what we're actually pursuing is net happiness for society. Okay, so it's a really central kind of ethical concept in terms of how business is structured and the profit maximization motive.